In the spring of 1942, while the United States was still counting the cost of Pearl Harbor, a different kind of mobilization began, one that did not involve tanks, aircraft, or men. It began with dogs. On March 13th, the Quartermaster General's office issued a single-page order, Circular No. 6. It authorized the creation of a new branch of the United States Army, the War Dog Training Program, later known as the K-9 Corps. The directive bore the signature of Major General Edmund B. Gregory, who wrote that K-9 resources may contribute materially to the national defense. It was bureaucratic language for something no army had ever done on this scale, to train animals as soldiers. By April, the first official training ground opened at Front Royal, Virginia. It occupied the rolling farmland of an old cavalry post. The man in charge was Major Clive D. Loftus, a meticulous officer who believed discipline could be taught as efficiently to dogs as to men. Under him served Captain Sidney W. Roderick, a quiet administrator who handled the logistics, feed rations, kennels, veterinary supplies, and endless paperwork. From the first week, the site was flooded with arrivals, not recruits in uniform, but ordinary Americans leading their family pets through the gates. The call had gone out through a civilian initiative called Dogs for Defense, founded in New York earlier that year. Newspapers printed appeals, "Your dog can serve the nation." By summer, more than 11,000 dogs had been offered to the Army. Only about 9,000 met the strict criteria: health, obedience, age between 1 and 5 years. The rest were turned away, returned to their owners with polite letters of thanks. The chosen few were mostly German shepherds, Doberman pinschers, collies, Airedales, and huskies. They arrived by train from across the country, tagged, numbered, and nervous. Each was paired with a handler drawn from the Quartermaster Corps. Every man carried a manual thinner than a pocket Bible. FM 25-6, Training of War Dogs. Its first line read, "The dog is to be considered a soldier. He must be trained as such." The days at Front Royal began before dawn. Whistles cut the fog. Kennels echoed with barking. Handlers drilled commands in clipped voices. Sit, down, heel, guard. Dogs learned to navigate obstacles, to crawl under barbed wire, to freeze at the sound of engines, to lie still when flares burst overhead. The smell of gunpowder was introduced gradually, mixed with food rations until fear turned to indifference. Major Loftus watched with the stern patience of a man turning chaos into discipline. By midsummer, the program expanded. New camps appeared at Camp Rimini, Montana, Cat Island, Mississippi, and San Carlos, California. Each specialized in different environments: mountain, jungle, coastal terrain. The animals trained for roles the manuals called scout, messenger, sentry, and mine detector. The work was experimental. There were no precedents, only intuition and adaptation. Veterinarians tested endurance, speed, and temperament. A shepherd that barked too freely might serve as a sentry. One that moved silently through brush was marked for scouting duty. Among the early observers at Front Royal was a young Marine Corps veterinarian, Corporal William W. Putney. He had volunteered to assist in medical evaluation. Years later, in his memoir Always Faithful, he would recall the atmosphere of that first summer. It was chaotic, improvised, and brilliant. The men were learning faster than the dogs, because they had to. Putney's job was to monitor injuries, infections, and the psychological stress of both species. He noted that handlers often formed attachments too quickly, and that separation after training caused morale problems. The Army's solution was practical. Each trained team, man and dog, would be assigned together to combat duty. Neither would be transferred without the other's approval. By late 1942, the Quartermaster Corps recorded 800 men and over 6,000 dogs in active training. Exercises included simulated night patrols with blackout conditions. Handlers wore gas masks. Dogs learned to detect hidden enemy figures at distances of up to 100 yards. One test, documented in the Front Royal After-Action Report, No. 17, described a shepherd locating a concealed soldier in 10 seconds less than the best human scout. Major Loftus wrote in the margin, "Efficiency beyond expectation." The training was not gentle. Temperatures in Virginia swung from humid heat to freezing rain. Dogs adapted better than men. Handlers complained of mud, fleas, and sleep deprivation. Loftus, known for his dry humor, told a visiting inspector, "At least these recruits don't argue back." He was right. The animals worked until exhaustion, resting only at night when the camp quieted and the distant freight trains hummed through the valley. In June, the quartermaster's office sent photographers from the Signal Corps to document progress. The black and white reels show lines of handlers marching with leashed dogs through morning mist. One image, catalogued as SC134528, captures the first K-9 Corps oath ceremony. An American flag waves over the parade ground. Dogs sit at attention beside their trainers. The narrator of the accompanying newsreel, a BBC correspondent, remarks, "Some of the Army's newest recruits have 4 legs." That summer, another name appeared in the logs, a mixed-braid German Shepherd Collie cross called Chips. Donated by the Wren family of Pleasantville, New York, he arrived at Front Royal on July 12, 1942. His assigned handler, Private John P. Rowell, described him as high-strung, quick, and fearless. Within weeks, Chips excelled in attack and sentry drills, responding instantly to visual cues. By autumn, the pair had completed their 12-week course and were transferred to the 3rd Military Police Platoon, 3rd Infantry Division. Their destination would eventually be Sicily. Meanwhile, Major Loftus's reports filled Washington files with data. He advocated standardized equipment, 6-foot leash, muzzle, and an identification tag engraved U.S. Army War Dog. He also pushed for better food rations, a mixture of horse meat and rice, supplemented with cod liver oil to maintain coat health. The attention to detail bordered on obsessive, but it worked. By year's end, every camp followed the same protocol, from feeding schedules to rest cycles. In December 1942, the Quartermaster's Department compiled a summary. To date, over 9,000 dogs have been processed. Of these, 5,000 are considered combat-ready. It was the birth certificate of a new military species, trained, catalogued, and ready for deployment. Yet the numbers hide the quiet transformation that took place behind the barbed fences. Men who had never owned pets now spoke to their dogs as partners. Handlers slept beside their animals in the kennels during storms. They learned to trust movement, breath, and instinct rather than words. Putney later wrote, "When a dog trusts you under fire, it changes what you think courage means." Those were not sentimental words. They were the observation of a scientist who had watched animals adapt to the unnatural logic of war faster than humans did. The final inspection at Front Royal came on a cold morning in January 1943. Rows of soldiers stood beside their dogs, boots lined perfectly, leashes taut. Major Loftus walked the ranks in silence, clipboard in hand. He stopped occasionally, noting the posture of a Doberman, the calm gaze of a shepherd. Then he gave a short nod, the kind that meant readiness. The next week, the first detachments were ordered to Camp Lejeune, North Carolina, where they would integrate with Marine infantry units bound for the Pacific. Others were dispatched to Fort Robinson, Nebraska, to train replacements for the European theater. The experiment was over. The Army now possessed a functioning K-9 Corps. In less than a year, what began as a one-page memo had become a new branch of warfare. Each dog carried a service number, a medical record, and a reputation for reliability that no machine could equal. They had learned to detect mines, to patrol silently, to warn of ambushes, to deliver messages when radios failed. And they had learned something men were still struggling with: to obey without hatred. In the final report of 1942, Major Loftus wrote a single sentence that captured the transformation better than any statistic. "The Army has found new soldiers. They just happen to have tails." By the end of that winter, 9,000 animals stood ready for deployment. They would serve in Africa, Italy, the Pacific, and later in France. Their training ground in the Virginia hills faded into routine. Another base, another unit. But history would remember it as the place where the modern military working dog was born. And as the freight trains carried the first K-9 units east toward the coast, the handlers stood beside the kennels, watching the lights disappear into the snow. They could not know where the war would take them. But every man understood one thing. From that moment on, the front line would never again belong to humans alone. By mid-1943, the United States Army had trained thousands of dogs for war, but few had yet heard gunfire in battle. That would change in the summer of that year, when the first K-9 units were deployed overseas. Their proving ground would be the beaches of Sicily. The arrival in the Mediterranean. In July 1943, as part of Operation Husky, elements of the 3rd Infantry Division and 45th Division landed under the command of General George S. Patton. Among the military police platoons assigned to the invasion was a small detachment carrying a dozen war dogs. Their handlers had trained at Front Royal and Fort Robinson, learning to operate as scouts and sentries. Among them was Private John P. Rowell, paired with his dog Chips, a mixed German Shepherd and Collie, whose name would soon become legend. The journey to Europe was rough. The dogs were kept below decks in modified crates, tended by their handlers during brief periods of calm. Rowell wrote later that the sound of the engines made them uneasy, but none refused food. On July 9, 1943, as the transports neared the Sicilian coast, the handlers prepared their animals for landing, muzzles secured, leashes tied to belts, boots coated in grease to prevent chafing in salt water. They came ashore under artillery fire near Licata. Smoke covered the sea. Tracer fire crossed the horizon. The dogs leapt into the surf beside their handlers, paddling through the tide as if it were another training obstacle. They shook the water from their coats and waited for orders. Chips was assigned to the perimeter of the beachhead. For 2 days, he patrolled supply areas, warning of approaching Italian stragglers and the occasional sniper. His keen sense of hearing, already noted during training, made him invaluable. On July 10th, during an early morning patrol, he detected movement in a nearby building, a machine gun nest hidden within a small concrete pillbox. Rowell ordered the squad to halt. Before the men could react, Chips broke free, charged through the doorway, and disappeared inside. The sound of automatic fire erupted, then stopped. When the soldiers rushed forward, they found 4 stunned Italian gunners emerging with hands raised. Chips had attacked one of them, biting his arm before being pulled off. He suffered powder burns along his face and a wound to his scalp. Minor, but visible in photographs later filed under Signal Corps Series SC-1774. The official after-action report from the 3rd Military Police Platoon recorded the event succinctly. Dog Chips displayed exceptional courage and initiative in neutralizing enemy position. The action saved dozens of lives on the beachhead, allowing the unit to advance without further resistance in that sector. For his conduct, Chips was recommended for the Silver Star, the Purple Heart, and the Distinguished Service Cross. Army regulations at the time prohibited formal awards to animals, but the citations were approved symbolically and noted in the division's history. The photograph of Chips, muzzle burned and eyes bright, appeared in newspapers across America. He became the face of the K-9 Corps, a symbol of instinct meeting discipline. Expansion of the K-9 program. The success in Sicily validated what the Quartermaster Corps had predicted the year before, that dogs could serve as reliable partners in active combat. In the months that followed, K-9 detachments were attached to infantry, engineers, and even signal units across the Mediterranean theater. Their duties expanded: mine detection, sentry work, and messenger service. At Anzio, in early 1944, the dogs were deployed under some of the most punishing conditions of the Italian campaign. Before that, however, came the long preparation and the growing pains of a new military experiment. Major Clive D. Loftus, still overseeing the training centers in the United States, sent continuous feedback to the field. Improve conditioning, shorten rest cycles, reduce handler rotation. His memos to the Quartermaster General stressed one point: the dog cannot be treated as equipment. He is a partner. If he is lost, morale suffers proportionally. Those lines would later appear, nearly word for word, in the Army's 1944 handbook, Care of War Dogs in the Field. Putney's role in the Pacific. While Europe tested the first generation of Army dogs, the Marine Corps developed its own program in the Pacific. Corporal William W. Putney, who had observed the early experiments at Front Royal, now commanded the 3rd War Dog Platoon. His unit trained at Camp Lejeune, North Carolina, before shipping out to Guam in 1944. Putney's field diaries describe a disciplined but emotional bond between handlers and their dogs. They slept beside us in the foxholes. When we moved, they moved. When we stopped, they listened before we did. Though his campaign came a year later, his correspondence circulated within the Quartermaster Corps and directly influenced operational doctrine for the European front. The Anzio Front. By January 1944, the Allied Sixth Corps had established a precarious beachhead at Anzio, Italy. But in late 1943, as plans were being finalized, K-9 detachments from Sicily were already being repositioned north. They arrived in cold rain and chaos, half-frozen ground, artillery thundering from the hills. The dogs were assigned to night patrols and mine-clearing teams. One surviving report from the 540th Engineer Combat Regiment credits scout dogs with identifying multiple booby-trapped positions before the infantry advanced. The handlers described their animals lowering to the ground, ears forward, signaling danger by freezing in place. The engineers marked the spots with white tape, later finding buried anti-personnel mines. In the same region, members of the 45th Division recorded that enemy infiltration attempts dropped sharply after K-9 units began patrolling supply routes. A diary entry from Lieutenant Thomas McHugh notes, "We stopped setting trip flares once the dogs arrived. They saw more, heard more, and never slept." Chips, meanwhile, continued service with Rowell's platoon through 1944. He was rotated between frontline and security duties. His injuries healed. When the 3rd Infantry Division entered Rome in June 1944, Chips was there, still carrying the same service number stenciled on his collar tag, A1P6. Rowell wrote home that the dog knows the difference between a German voice and an American one, a claim supported by other handlers who noted the animal's ability to distinguish accents or commands, shouted in different tones. The reality of the front line. Life for the K-9 units was neither glamorous nor simple. Dogs faced the same exhaustion, hunger, and stress as their human partners. They endured shellfire, cold, and disease. In Sicily and Italy, tick fever and dysentery were constant threats. Veterinary medics improvised treatments with limited supplies, sulfa powder, iodine, and morphine diluted for animal use. They learned to fashion splints from branches, bandages from torn uniforms. Each dog had an identification card and medical record, updated after every operation. The field reports reveal an often overlooked detail. Dogs reacted not to the sound of artillery, but to the scent of fear. Handlers discovered that their animals tensed seconds before an ambush, muscles stiffening, eyes narrowing. These physiological reactions became an early warning system. A sergeant in the 3rd Division summarized it best. When the dog stopped breathing, we knew we were not alone. As the campaign in Italy intensified, the number of K-9 casualties increased. Records from February 1944 list over 100 dogs wounded and 23 killed during the Anzio operations alone. The Army had no official burial procedure. Handlers often dug shallow graves beside the trenches, marking them with wooden stakes. In later years, veterans would remember those quiet ceremonies more vividly than the battles themselves. Recognition and return. By the end of 1943, newspapers in the United States began publishing stories about the war dogs of the front. Photographs of Chips, ears perked and muzzle bandaged, appeared with headlines like "Dog Hero in Sicily." He was awarded an unofficial Silver Star and Purple Heart by his unit before the Army revoked the decorations, citing Regulation AR 645. Still, the recognition stood in the hearts of those who had served beside him. When Chips returned home in late 1945, he was honored by Dogs for Defense as the most decorated dog of the war. His actions would later inspire the post-war creation of permanent military working dog programs. Back in Europe, the Anzio K-9 detachments continued their mission through the winter. By spring 1944, they had been integrated into patrol schedules as standard units. Commanders who had once doubted their usefulness now requested additional teams. Major Loftus wrote from Washington, "Field reports confirm, efficiency increased, casualties reduced. Recommendation, expand program to all theaters." A new kind of soldier. The Second World War had introduced many forms of innovation: radar, code-breaking, jet propulsion. But the dogs represented something simpler and older. They were the link between instinct and order, nature and machinery. They did not understand politics or flags or borders, yet they learned to move through minefields and silence an enemy gun position. They did it without promise of reward or knowledge of victory. In the spring of 1944, as the Allies advanced north through Italy, the handlers led their animals through ruins and vineyards, past civilians returning to shattered homes. Children waved at the sight of the dogs in uniform. The handlers rarely smiled. They knew too well what those animals had seen, and what they still had to face. The Army's report for the end of that year summarized the impact of the K-9 Corps with characteristic brevity. Efficiency of patrols increased by 30% in areas utilizing trained dogs. Morale among handlers rated superior to average infantry units. Those numbers told a story few outside the field could grasp. The war had turned creatures of trust into instruments of survival. And as new campaigns loomed, Normandy, the Ardennes, the Pacific, the Army prepared to send even more of its silent soldiers into battle. They would go where radios failed, where sight and sound meant death, where courage could only be measured by a heartbeat and a steady breath in the dark. By 1944, the K-9 Corps was no longer an experiment. It was a fixture on nearly every front. In Italy, France, the Pacific, and the islands of Micronesia, dogs now marched with the infantry, guarded supply lines, and searched minefields where no man wished to crawl. The idea born in a quiet Virginia valley 2 years earlier had spread across the world, and with it came the cost that every soldier eventually paid. The field hospitals. At Anzio, the winter of 1944 brought rain, mud, and exhaustion. The Allied beachhead, 6 miles deep, 20 wide, was under constant artillery fire. For weeks, men lived in trenches flooded knee-deep in water. The dogs lived there with them. They slept curled beside their handlers, ears twitching to every shell burst. Casualty reports from the Quartermaster Corps Veterinary Service list over 100 wounded dogs between January and March. Most injuries came from shrapnel and small arms fire, others from mines or collapsing rubble. There were no field hospitals designed for animals, only improvisation. Medics set up cots under canvas tarps and treated the dogs alongside wounded soldiers. Sulfa powder, morphine diluted for weight, iodine swabbed on raw skin. These became the tools of a new kind of combat medicine. Captain Sidney W. Roderick, who had once managed paperwork at Front Royal, now served in Italy overseeing veterinary logistics. In a letter to Washington dated March 4th, he wrote, "Equipment improvised, patients respond. Morale of handlers directly tied to condition of their dogs." His short sentences carried a quiet urgency. The War Department would later cite them as justification for establishing permanent veterinary detachments with every K-9 unit. Guam. The Marine Dogs. While Europe fought through Italy, the Pacific saw its own chapter of the story. On July 21, 1944, U.S. Marines landed on Guam, the first American territory retaken after 2 years of Japanese occupation. Among them was the 3rd War Dog Platoon, commanded by Colonel William W. Putney, the same veterinarian who had helped shape the program at Front Royal. Guam's terrain was unlike anything in Europe: dense jungle, razor grass, and coral ridges. Visibility was measured in feet. The Japanese defenders used caves, snipers, and booby traps. Traditional scouting was useless. The dogs became the Marines' eyes. Putney's platoon numbered 60 handlers and 90 dogs, mostly German Shepherds and Dobermans. Their orders: patrol ahead of the infantry, detect ambushes, and locate wounded after engagements. The unit worked day and night, often in silence except for the whisper of leaves and the faint jingle of metal tags. In one report, filed July 27th, Putney wrote, "Dog, K-327, alerted on enemy 100 yards ahead. Patrol halted. Grenades thrown. Position neutralized. No Marine casualties." That single entry reflected the value of an entire platoon. Over the course of the Guam campaign, War Dog platoons detected 170 hidden enemy positions, prevented 75 ambushes, and located over 300 wounded Marines who would otherwise have been listed as missing. Losses in the jungle. The success came at a price. 25 dogs were killed in action on Guam, many by grenades or sniper fire aimed directly at the sound of barking. Putney insisted each be buried with its handler's platoon, marked with a wooden cross bearing the dog's name and serial number. Photographs from the USMC Historical Division show rows of small graves beneath palm trees, flags planted beside helmets. In his later memoir, Always Faithful, Putney described the night after the battle for Mount Alifan. "We had 6 dogs down that day. The men dug graves by lantern light. No one spoke. When the bugler played taps, even the remaining dogs were silent." He ended the entry with a single observation. "They gave their loyalty without question. We owed them remembrance." Europe's final push. While the Marines fought across the Pacific, the European K-9 units moved north through Italy and into France. The 3rd Infantry Division, still accompanied by Chips and Pitt John Rowell, crossed into southern France during Operation Dragoon in August 1944. By then, Chips had served in combat for over a year. He was older, scarred, but still alert. Rowell's last field report describes him locating 2 German sentries hiding in a vineyard near Saint-Tropez. Shortly afterward, Chips was withdrawn from active duty due to fatigue. He was sent back to the United States for rest before eventual demobilization. Across the front, dogs continued to perform tasks that blurred the line between animal instinct and military procedure. They carried messages through smoke when radios failed. They guided stretcher teams to the wounded. they stood guard over prisoners. The 540th Engineer Regiment noted that mine detection dogs reduced casualties by nearly 1/3 during the advance into northern Italy. The human cost handlers rarely spoke of fear, but reports reveal its shadow. When a dog was wounded, the man beside him felt the loss as if it were his own limb. In one incident near Cisterna, a scout dog named Pal was struck by mortar fragments. His handler refused evacuation until the animal was carried out first. The medic's log simply reads, "Both stable, both returned to duty after 2 days." Such moments never reached newspapers or commendations. They lived in the margins of after-action reports. Army policy forbade sentimentality in official writing, yet traces of emotion leaked through. Major Loftus, reviewing field data in Washington, added a handwritten note to a casualty list. Numbers conceal courage. It was the only personal remark in an otherwise sterile document. Veterinary innovation. The demands of 1944 forced rapid advances in military veterinary science. Portable operating tables, fold-up kennels, and field blood transfusion kits were introduced. The Army Veterinary School at Fort Leavenworth began including a new module, Treatment of War Dog Casualties. By autumn, Putney's techniques on Guam were being circulated as official reference material. He had devised a method for stopping arterial bleeding, using tourniquets cut from leash straps, and replacing lost fluids with coconut water when saline ran out. The improvised procedure saved multiple animals during the campaign. Later medical tests confirmed it as viable emergency practice, the first of its kind in modern veterinary combat care. The end of a campaign Guam was declared secure on August 10, 1944. Putney's platoon remained on the island to clear caves and search for stragglers. One dog, Caesar, located a hidden cache of explosives that prevented a deadly ambush. Another, Jack, detected a wounded Marine lying unconscious in tall grass long after the battle had ended. Each action was recorded, timed, and verified by witnesses. By the end of the operation, the platoon's efficiency rating was 96%, the highest of any unit in the 3rd Marine Division. When the Marines finally rested, Putney gathered his men for a brief ceremony. He read from the report that would later reach Washington. War Dog platoons have proven indispensable. Their service equals that of any human soldier. No medals were issued, only a handshake and the word "faithful." That night the men removed the tags from the collars of their fallen dogs and kept them as talismans. Across the fronts in Europe, the tide of war was turning. Allied armies were pushing through France toward Germany. K-9 units marched through ruined villages, past civilians who stared in disbelief at the sight of uniformed dogs wearing service numbers. Some villagers offered food, others simply nodded. To many Europeans who had seen German sentry dogs used for terror, these animals symbolized liberation. By late 1944, the Quartermaster General's report counted over 10,400 dogs trained since the program's inception. Of these, roughly 1,800 had served overseas. Losses were estimated at 550 killed or missing. The document closed with a single summary line. Morale and effectiveness of dog units, excellent. Recommend continuation post-war. Reflection. The soldiers who returned from Italy and the Pacific rarely spoke about the dogs in public. To them it was not novelty, but memory. In interviews decades later, handlers described the same recurring sound, the quick breath beside them before an ambush, the stillness when danger passed. It was that rhythm, they said, that kept them alive. Corporal Putney summed it best in a letter written on Guam in November 1944. We measure bravery in medals. Theirs came in silence. He mailed the letter to his wife in California. It arrived 2 months late, stained with humidity, and folded in quarters. She kept it for the rest of her life. Closing scene. When 1944 drew to an end, winter once again covered the training grounds back in Virginia. The kennels at Front Royal were nearly empty. New recruits were already being prepared for the coming invasion of Japan. But across the oceans, in Italy, in France, on Guam, and in the Philippines, the graves of war dogs marked a new chapter of military history. Small wooden crosses scattered across continents, each bearing a name and a number. No speeches were made, no parades held. Only the handlers remembered the warmth of a heartbeat beside them in the mud, the weight of trust that could not be replaced. They had learned what the Army had only begun to understand, that loyalty, once given, demands its own kind of sacrifice. The war was ending. In Europe, cities lay silent under the weight of ashes. In the Pacific, the jungles still smoked after months of fire. By the summer of 1945, the U.S. Army counted its survivors, men, machines, and the thousands of animals that had served beside them. Among them were the war dogs. For the first time in military history, an official report listed them not as property, but as personnel. The demobilization begins. On August 15, 1945, the day Japan announced its surrender, teletype messages from the Quartermaster General went out to every command. Initiate demobilization of war dog units effective immediately. Across Europe and the Pacific, handlers read the orders in silence. For many, the thought of parting from their dogs was harder than facing combat. These animals had been with them in foxholes, on patrol, through heat and snow and fear. Now they would be shipped home for rehabilitation and discharge. The War Department estimated over 10,000 dogs had completed service since 1942. Roughly 1,800 had served overseas. About 500 had been killed or listed as missing in action. Each surviving dog had to be examined, quarantined, and retrained before returning to civilian life. The process would take months. In September 1945, the War Dog Reception and Rehabilitation Center opened at Camp Lejeune, North Carolina, under the supervision of CPL William W. Putney. He had returned from Guam with the 3rd War Dog Platoon and was assigned to oversee the transition. The center's mission was simple: reverse the instincts of war. The process of untraining. Handlers and veterinarians began the slow work of what they called detuning. Dogs that had learned to attack on command had to relearn gentleness. Sentries accustomed to gunfire had to accept peace and quiet. Putney described the effort in his 1945 field notes. We trained them for months to distrust strangers. Now we must teach them that hands mean kindness again. Each animal underwent a period of 3 to 6 weeks of decompression. Loud noises were reintroduced gradually. Food was provided by multiple caretakers to desensitize against possessiveness, and socialization with civilians was monitored. Those who passed behavioral tests were cleared for adoption, either back to their original owners or to new families approved by the Army. The records are meticulous. One line from War Dog File, Georgia 4127 reads, Dog, Caesar, Doberman, returned to owner Mrs. M. Whitman, Los Angeles, November 2nd, 1945. Condition, good. Another. Dog, Jack, German Shepherd, transferred to civilian police service, Chicago, December 11th, 1945. The cost of care, medical treatment, and transport was borne entirely by the War Department. An acknowledgement of debt to creatures who could never read the orders they obeyed. Reunion and farewell. In January 1946, newspapers across the United States carried photographs of soldiers reunited with their dogs. One widely circulated image from the Signal Corps showed a Marine kneeling as his dog leapt into his arms at the dock in San Francisco. The caption read simply, Home from War. Putney oversaw hundreds of such reunions. He later recalled one in particular, a handler who recognized his dog's bark from across the yard before seeing him. The man stopped, removed his cap, and said nothing for nearly a minute. Then he smiled for the first time since Guam. Not all reunions were possible. Some handlers had been killed in action. Others were still overseas. In those cases, the dogs were rehomed. A few were transferred into civilian defense work, police K-9 units, border patrol, or search and rescue services. It was the quiet beginning of a post-war legacy that would stretch into every corner of modern law enforcement. The public reaction. By spring 1946, the American public had embraced the story of the war dogs. Magazines such as Life and Collier's published full-page spreads titled, "They Served Too," and "Heroes on Four Legs." The nation that had once doubted the idea of training animals for combat now saw them as symbols of loyalty and sacrifice. Children wrote letters to Fort Robinson and Front Royal, asking to adopt a real war dog. Veterans' parades featured units marching with their canine partners, ribbons tied to collars. Yet the handlers themselves remained modest. Asked by reporters about their experiences, they spoke not of heroism, but of routine. "Just another soldier," one sergeant said, patting his dog's back. "They did their job, that's all." The memorial. In the summer of 1946, the Army decided that such service should not vanish into the files of the Quartermaster Corps. With donations from soldiers, veterinarians, and citizens, a monument was commissioned at Fort Robinson, Nebraska, later duplicated at Camp Carson, Colorado. It was called the War Dog Memorial. The bronze sculpture, created by artist Walter A. Weber, depicted a crouching Doberman in alert posture, ears forward, muscles tensed, neither threatening nor submissive, but ready. The base bore a simple inscription, "They served with honor." On October 15, 1946, veterans of the 3rd War Dog Platoon attended the dedication. CPO William W. Putney stood beside the monument, his uniform immaculate, his voice measured as he read the opening words of the ceremony. "In war, they were soldiers. In peace, they remain our guardians." Beside him stood a line of handlers, each holding a leash, each dog wearing its wartime tag. The wind carried the sound of the flag ropes against the pole, a metallic rhythm that echoed through the silence. The Signal Corps recorded the event on film. Few noticed the man who paused at the end of the line to place a small wooden tag on the base. It bore a single name, Chips. He had died peacefully at home earlier that year, his ashes kept by the Wren family who had donated him in 1942. His collar tag read A1P6. To this day, it remains preserved in the archives of the National WWII Museum in New Orleans. Legacy and continuation. The lessons learned from the War Dog program reshaped modern military training. In 1947, the U.S. Army established the Permanent War Dog Training School at Fort Belvoir, Virginia, later relocated to Lackland Air Force Base, Texas, where it still operates. The doctrine developed by Loftus and Putney formed the foundation of the Military Working Dog, MWD program, active in Korea, Vietnam, Iraq, and Afghanistan. Veterinary medicine also advanced. The field techniques tested on Guam, blood transfusions, field anesthesia, psychological rehabilitation, became standard practice in both military and civilian veterinary schools. Putney continued to advocate for the welfare of service animals long after the war, writing articles and speaking at Army medical conferences. He would later retire as a colonel, but he remained known among Marines simply as the Doctor of the Dogs. The numbers and the silence official Army statistics from the final War Dog Report, June 1946, summarized 4 years of service in understated prose. Total dogs procured, 10,425 trained for duty, 9,364 served overseas, 1,889 killed in action, 536 returned to civilian life, 7,068 missing or unaccounted. 87. The report ended with one final line. The contribution of K-9 forces to the war effort is acknowledged with gratitude. No parade followed. The kennels at Front Royal were closed that autumn. the buildings converted to storage. At Fort Robinson, the last training group was released. Handlers went home, many to farms or small towns, where the memories of noise and dust slowly faded. But those who had served in the K-9 Corps carried something that could not be demobilized: the image of an animal standing alert beside them in darkness, waiting for a command that would never come again. Epilogue. Always Faithful. Years later, in 2001, Colonel William W. Putney published his memoir, Always Faithful, a memoir of the Marine dogs of WWII. He was in his 80s. In its final chapter, he wrote, "I have lived long enough to see statues built and flags folded. But what matters is that we remember their trust. They never knew why they fought, only that we asked them to." His words closed the circle begun in March 1942 with Circular Number 6. The idea that loyalty could be trained became the understanding that it could also be shared. Today, at Guam's War Dog Cemetery, maintained by the U.S. Navy and local volunteers, 25 graves remain. Their markers bear names once typed on ration cards and medical logs: Jack, Caesar, Skipper, Rex. Above them stands the bronze Doberman statue sculpted by Walter Weber, the same design first unveiled at Fort Robinson. Its head faces west, toward the sea from which the Marines came. At sunset, the light catches the engraved words on the base. They didn't know they were heroes. And the camera would fade to black there, a quiet memorial, an echo of footsteps and paws fading into the wind.